Most people believe that truth is revealed through confrontation. They think exposing manipulation requires arguments, explanations, or dramatic moments of clarity. But psychology often teaches us the opposite. Very often, the deepest truths emerge not from what we say, but from what we refuse to say. Silence, when used with awareness, becomes a powerful psychological instrument. A narcissistic woman depends heavily on emotional reactions. Her influence thrives in an environment where she can provoke, confuse, or destabilize the people around her. Attention, whether positive or negative, is the currency that sustains the illusion of control. When someone argues with her, defends themselves endlessly, or tries to logically dismantle her accusations, they unknowingly step into a game designed for them to lose. Because the goal was never truth, the goal was reaction. This is why silence becomes so disruptive to the narcissistic dynamic. When you refuse to engage in emotional combat, the structure that supports the manipulation begins to weaken. Your silence interrupts the script. The expected drama does not occur. The emotional fuel she relies on is suddenly absent. Carl Jung often emphasized that people project parts of themselves onto others, especially the parts they refuse to confront within their own psyche. A narcissistic personality is particularly dependent on this projection. She needs others to carry emotions she cannot tolerate in herself. Shame, insecurity, vulnerability. When you react, you unknowingly participate in that psychological exchange. But when you remain calm, grounded, and silent, something unusual happens. The projection has nowhere to land. The mask begins to slip, not because you exposed it with accusations, but because it cannot sustain itself without your participation. What once appeared confident and powerful begins to show cracks. Irritation turns into frustration. Frustration often reveals desperation. And in that moment, something profound becomes visible. You realize that the mask was never held in place by her strength. It was held in place by your reactions. Silence, then, is not weakness. It is awareness in action. Because the moment you stop feeding the illusion is the moment the illusion begins to starve. If silence begins to weaken the illusion, the next step goes even deeper, the withdrawal of attention. In psychological terms, attention is not a small thing. It is one of the most powerful forms of reinforcement in human relationships. Where attention goes, energy flows. And for a narcissistic personality, attention becomes the very substance that maintains their sense of identity. A narcissistic woman often builds her sense of importance through the reactions of others. Admiration strengthens the image she presents to the world, but even conflict serves a purpose. Arguments, emotional debates, and constant explanations still keep her at the center of your mental world. In this way, attention, whether loving or hostile, continues to feed the illusion of significance. This is why many people feel trapped in these dynamics. They believe they are resisting the manipulation, when in reality they are still participating in the system that sustains it. Every emotional investment, every attempt to prove a point, every effort to make her understand becomes another form of attention. But something remarkable happens when attention is quietly withdrawn. You stop explaining yourself. You stop trying to correct every distortion of the truth. You stop reacting to provocations designed to pull you back into emotional engagement. And when this happens, the psychological balance begins to shift. The narcissistic personality often experiences this as a loss of control. The familiar channels through which he once influenced you suddenly become ineffective. Without your focus, without your emotional investment, the narrative she built around herself begins to lose stability. The image that once felt powerful now struggles to hold its shape. Carl Jung spoke about how the ego constantly seeks validation through external reflection. For a narcissistic individual, that reflection is not simply comforting, it is essential. When the mirror disappears, the constructed identity begins to tremble. And that is the quiet power of withdrawing attention. You do not need to argue. You do not need to expose anything publicly. By simply reclaiming your focus and directing it back toward your own life, you allow the illusion to collapse under its own weight. Because the most devastating thing you can remove from a narcissistic dynamic is not your voice. It is your attention. Once attention is withdrawn, another shift begins to take place, one that is even more revealing. Your emotional detachment starts to expose what could never be seen, while you are still emotionally entangled in the dynamic. When people are deeply involved in manipulation, they often believe the solution is to react more intelligently, to argue more effectively, or to defend themselves more clearly. But the problem with this approach is that it keeps you inside the emotional arena where manipulation operates most effectively. A narcissistic personality is often highly skilled at navigating emotional chaos, confusion, guilt, anger. These are environments where they feel strangely comfortable. But emotional detachment changes the landscape entirely. Detachment does not mean becoming cold or bitter. It means stepping out of the emotional turbulence that once pulled you into constant reaction. Instead of defending yourself against every accusation or responding to every subtle provocation, you begin to observe rather than participate. And this shift is profound. Carl Jung often spoke about the importance of consciousness, of bringing awareness to unconscious patterns that quietly shape our behavior. When you detach emotionally, you begin to see patterns that were previously hidden beneath emotional intensity. You notice how blame appears whenever accountability approaches. You observe how affection may suddenly appear when control begins to slip away. You start to recognize the rhythm of manipulation itself. For a narcissistic woman, this can become deeply unsettling. Her strategies rely on emotional responses that keep you engaged in the cycle. But when your reactions disappear, those strategies lose their effectiveness. The charm, the guilt, the subtle psychological pressure, these tools suddenly meet something they cannot easily penetrate: calm awareness. Without your emotional participation, the performance begins to falter. What once seemed persuasive now appears repetitive. What once felt powerful now begins to look predictable. And in that moment, the true personality behind the performance starts to reveal itself. Not because you forced it into the open, but because there is no longer anything protecting the illusion. Emotional detachment, in this sense, becomes a form of quiet clarity. It allows you to see what was always there, but hidden behind the noise of constant reaction. Because the moment you stop reacting is the moment you finally start seeing. Once emotional detachment begins to reveal the pattern, Another essential element naturally follows: boundaries. Not the kind of boundaries people often talk about in emotional conversations. Long explanations, repeated warnings, or passionate declarations about what will and will not be tolerated. In many cases, those words simply become another opportunity for manipulation. What truly shifts the dynamic are boundaries that are expressed through behavior rather than speeches. A narcissistic personality often has a remarkable ability to navigate verbal resistance. If you explain your limits repeatedly, those limits can slowly be negotiated, challenged, or reframed. The conversation itself becomes a stage where the narcissistic mind attempts to regain influence. They may reinterpret your words, provoke guilt, or shift the focus so that you find yourself explaining your position over and over again. But boundaries that exist in action are much harder to distort. When you quietly limit access to your time, your energy, and your emotional availability, you are communicating something far more powerful than an argument. You are demonstrating that your internal world is no longer open territory for manipulation. You answer less frequently. You engage only when necessary. You stop participating in conversations that lead nowhere. These changes may appear small on the surface, but psychologically, they represent a major shift in power. Carl Jung often emphasized the process of individuation, the gradual development of a self that is rooted in inner authority rather than external pressure. Boundaries are a practical expression of this inner authority. They signal that your identity and your peace are no longer dependent on the approval or reactions of someone who thrives on control. For a narcissistic woman, this quiet firmness can feel deeply unsettling. Without dramatic confrontation, without emotional arguments, she begins to encounter something unfamiliar: resistance that cannot be negotiated. The usual tactics: provocation, charm, blame, find fewer and fewer openings, and eventually a realization begins to form. The dynamic she once controlled no longer operates the same way, because real boundaries do not ask for permission. They simply exist. And the moment your actions start reflecting yourself, respect is the moment manipulation begins to lose its power.
Once boundaries begin to reshape the dynamic, something else becomes possible, something that was almost impossible before. You gain the ability to observe clearly, and observation, when it is calm and honest, has a way of dissolving illusions faster than confrontation ever could. When people are emotionally caught in manipulation, they are usually reacting moment by moment. One accusation leads to a defense. One guilt trip leads to an explanation. One emotional outburst leads to another attempt to restore peace. In that constant movement, it becomes very difficult to see the larger pattern. Each moment feels isolated, as if every conflict is a new misunderstanding that simply needs to be resolved. But when you step back and begin observing rather than reacting, the pattern slowly reveals itself. Carl Jung spoke often about the unconscious patterns that shape human behavior. Many people repeat the same emotional strategies without fully realizing it. A narcissistic personality, in particular, tends to follow a predictable psychological rhythm. When admiration is available, there is charm. When admiration fades, there may be subtle criticism. When control begins to weaken, blame or emotional pressure often appears. And when distance grows, sudden attempts at affection or reconciliation can emerge. If you are constantly reacting, this sequence can feel confusing. But if you simply observe, the repetition becomes impossible to ignore. You begin to notice that the conversation changes whenever accountability approaches. You see how responsibility quietly shifts away from her and somehow lands back on you. You recognize how moments of warmth sometimes arrive precisely when you begin to reclaim your independence. Observation removes the emotional fog. It allows you to see behavior not as isolated incidents, but as part of a pattern. And patterns are powerful teachers, because once you clearly see the pattern, the manipulation loses much of its mystery. You stop asking yourself why each moment feels uncomfortable, because you understand the structure behind it. The confusion fades, and with it, the impulse to constantly fix or explain things. Observation in this way becomes a form of quiet liberation, because the moment you truly see the pattern is the moment the pattern can no longer control you. And after silence, after the withdrawal of attention, after emotional detachment, boundaries, and careful observation, something deeper begins to emerge within you. It is not simply a strategy anymore. It becomes a shift in identity. At the center of that shift lies one powerful principle: self-respect. For many people, the reason narcissistic dynamics continue for so long is not because the manipulation is impossible to recognize. On some level, the warning signs are often felt early. The discomfort, the confusion, the subtle sense that something is always slightly off. These signals appear long before the mind fully understands them. But people stay because they hope that patience, love, or explanation will eventually bring balance to the relationship. What often goes unnoticed is that a narcissistic dynamic quietly erodes self-respect over time, not through one dramatic moment, but through countless small compromises. You explain yourself more than you should. You tolerate behavior that once felt unacceptable. You begin adjusting your emotional reality just to keep the peace. Slowly, almost invisibly, your inner stability becomes dependent on someone else's unpredictable behavior. Carl Jung spoke about the importance of becoming an integrated individual, someone whose sense of self is grounded internally rather than shaped by constant external approval or rejection. Self-respect is a living expression of that integration. It is the quiet understanding that your peace, your dignity, and your psychological well-being are not negotiable. When that realization takes root, something remarkable happens. You no longer feel the need to convince, correct, or expose the narcissistic behavior. You simply begin to live differently. Your time becomes more protected. Your emotional energy becomes more selective. Your presence becomes less available to dynamics that drain your sense of self. And in that shift, the mask falls in the most natural way possible. Because the narcissistic illusion was never sustained by your ignorance alone. It was sustained by your willingness to remain inside the system. The moment your self-respect becomes stronger than your desire to maintain the illusion, the dynamic quietly collapses. You do not need a dramatic ending. You do not need the final argument. Sometimes the most powerful act of self-respect is simply this: you walk forward with clarity, and you stop carrying what was never yours to hold.